Добрый день.
Good afternoon. I'm glad to meet all of you again. My presence in New York is due to the fact that under the Russian presidency yesterday and today, we've held two central events, the open debate, namely, it means that they can be attended not just by the members of the UN Security Council, but all the delegations who wish to do so. So both yesterday and today, we've had a great number of participants. The first issue that we took up during the open debate yesterday was dedicated to the discussion of the fundamental aspects of international relations, multilateral cooperation, and multipolarity. We have drawn the attention to the fact that the system set up after the Second World War and was based upon the central role of the UN is eroding step by step. I think you've heard both my statement and the statements of other participants. We hardly expected that we would be able to agree on most issues given the current tense atmosphere and the international relations, and given how the relations between the collective West and the world majority are developing. But be that as it may, even though we harbored no illusion, we think this discussion has been very useful. Anyway, most participants have agreed that there are themes to be discussed, there are problems. Many have shared assessments which coincide with our vision of the nascent multipolar world order, which is currently emerging, objectively speaking, and I spoke about that in my statement as well. The second conclusion is that there's a high chance that the discussion is going to be followed up on. There is a growing interest in that. We are going to support that interest by all means at our disposal. We're going to organize additional discussions on this topic, not just at the UN, but in other platforms, multilateral platforms as well, including the G20, certainly in BRICS, in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, as well as in our contacts with regional organizations, associations of Asia, Latin America, and Africa. And as the representative Guyana said yesterday quite clearly, we need to rebuild trust because so far there is no dialogue whatsoever. And another point he made, it's impossible to rebuild trust unless everyone, without exception, sticks to the agreement that we have arrived at. So far, we're not witnessing any sign that this is happening, and it was the impression and assessment shared yesterday, and the same was said in particular during this open debate with a particular emphasis on Palestine, on the Middle East. Most resolutions on the Middle East, on Palestine, are not being observed. And the second open debate I've mentioned is still going on. Many participants have spoken in favor of resolute steps. Their position coincides with ours. The first thing to do is to put an end to the hostilities, to the military operation, to announce an indefinite ceasefire, to address the dire humanitarian situation, and certainly put an end to Israel's activities involving the construction of illegal colony settlements. And once that is done, we hope that this is going to be done, this will create the environment for resuming the UN talks on the establishment of a Palestinian state that is going to peacefully and securely coexist with Israel. Our presidency continues, and the day after tomorrow, July the 19th, we've scheduled another round of open debate. It's going to be chaired by my deputy, Mr. Vershinin. It's going to be dedicated to the relations between the UN and the CSTO, the CIS, and the SCO. Incidentally, I've had a series of bilaterals with the ministers of Arab states, with the foreign minister of Hungary, as well as with the foreign minister of Switzerland. So that's my summary. So let's go into talks. I'll take your questions now.
To UN Correspondent Association, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Foreign Minister, on behalf of the United Nations Correspondent Association. It's Valeria Robecco from ANSA Newswire. My question is, President Zelensky on Monday said that Russia should be represented at a second peace summit on Ukraine in November. Will you consider participating? What do you expect from that? Thank you so much.
Well, we've spoken on this subject on multiple occasions now and shared our assessments. The second summit, as you point out, is a natural follow-up to the process which was launched a year ago when in Copenhagen a small group of states gathered together. It was followed by a number of other meetings called the Copenhagen format. Each and every time our Western counterparts by hook or by crook, using different means at their disposals, giving promises, trying to draw as many countries to participate in those events as possible. And the last time the Copenhagen format met in Davos, it happened in January, and the margins of the World Economic Forum. Right afterwards, the first ministerial session of the UN Security Council on Palestinian issue happened. It was chaired by France. I also participated in that event. And my Swiss counterpart, Ignazio Cassis, also was in New York back then. We had a meeting. It was their request. And I said that, yes, there was another Copenhagen format meeting in the margins of the World Economic Forum. And after that, Minister Cassis, speaking to journalists, said that it was impossible to reach an agreement without Russia's participation. So I asked him, if you're convinced of that, why hold another meeting? There was no response. But the response is as follows. They've taken a course towards pushing by any means the so-called Zelensky's plans, which to a large extent looks like an ultimatum. And my Swiss counterpart warned me back in January that after that they would hold a peace summit, but it was not a summit per se, it was a peace conference. Yes, it was attended by a number of leaders, but most of those who came to the conference were represented at a lower level. It was a month ago in Bergenstock in Switzerland. That's where the meeting was held. And after that, the overwhelming majority of participants shared very restrained, if not negative, assessments of the outcome of that meeting. We could get back to that later, but let me get back to the second summit that you have mentioned. After Bergenstock, both Zelensky and some Western representatives started floating the idea of a second summit, citing Switzerland and other countries that could offer a platform for the second round of that conference. But speaking about the subject they would broach at that conference, everyone without exception came up with some unilateral approaches, which is unacceptable to us and to most who are interested in peace. Zelensky said that in Bergenstock they made the first step, they made the first jump towards a peace summit, and he said now we have to prepare a document which is going to be put on the table before Russia to make sure that different powerful countries attempt to secure an end to this war. What that means is difficult to discern. The one thing that is certain is Zelensky's formula is unacceptable, and everyone knows that, but still this formula underlies all of the proposals. So, speaking about peace attempts, for some reason everyone is speaking about Bergenstock alone. No one speaks about China's initiative, even though there has been several initiatives coming from China at the beginning of this year, and then later there were some other initiatives. Just recently, China, together with Brazil, came up with new elements of this initiative. I'm not going to enumerate them, but the main difference from Zelensky's formula and from what is happening during the Copenhagen format consists in the following. To start with, China, Brazil, and many other countries that have joined them call for a conference based on the principles and fundamentals that are going to be acceptable to all parties. Secondly, with regard to the substance of the dialogue, China, during its first initiative, said clearly that attention had to be given to the original root causes of the current crisis in Europe, and agreements had to be made, according to China, on how to remove those original causes. But neither during the Copenhagen format nor during Bergenstock, no one spoke about the original causes. We spoke about that yesterday in particular. We spoke about the coup d'etat, the ban on the Russian language, physical, violent acts with the use of the armed forces against those regions of Ukraine that refused to recognize as legitimate those who arrived in power during the coup d'etat, the Minsk agreements no one intended to stick to. Speaking about the evolution of this process as a whole, well, they say that Russia needs to withdraw back to the 1991 borders. But the whole problem consists in the fact that we've been lied to. If in February 2014, the agreement that was signed by President Yanukovych on the one hand and the opposition on the other hand had been observed, and it consisted in establishing a national unity government and in calling early presidential election. So had this agreement been observed, Ukraine would still be in its 1991 borders. But this agreement was sabotaged by the very people who signed that agreement from the opposition side. Right after the coup d'etat, after seizing the administrative buildings, they said they were revoking the status of the Russian language. They demanded that Russians should liberate Crimea. I mean, those Russian-speaking people who lived there. And because of that, it was impossible to preserve Ukraine in the 1991 borders. Crimea had a referendum, and not a single person whose objective doubts that this is how it got back to Russia. Whereas those who refused to recognize the coup d'etat, they were declared as terrorists. The armed forces are terrorly. The air force have been employed against them. They resisted, and back then that part of Ukraine ceased to be part of Ukraine. After that, the Minsk agreements happened. We put an end to what had been unfolding. The Minsk agreements stipulated that these republics that declared their independence first, it was stipulated that they would remain in Ukraine provided that they were granted special status. And that status didn't involve anything complicated. First, they had the right to their police, like here in the US, where at level of states there are police forces. They also had, they wanted the Russian language status to be guaranteed. They wanted the right to nominate their own judges and prosecutors. This is more or less the same what President Macron has promised to Corsica. I don't know whether he's going to succeed in that. So had the Minsk agreements been implemented, Ukraine would have remained in the 1991 borders minus Crimea, because back then no one spoke about Crimea at all. April 2022, after the start of the special military operation, we spoke on multiple occasions and in great detail about the origins of this decision, because it happened after many years during which we came up with warnings saying that NATO had to stop its eastward expansion, Nazi regime had to be reined in, because they were trying to prevent the use of the Russian language. They didn't want Russian-speaking people to live in the territories that were native to them. So, after many warnings, in April 2022, if the Istanbul Agreement had been signed, then Ukraine would have remained in the 1991 borders, minus Crimea and minus that part of the territory which back then was under the control of the Russian armed forces. But it turned out that we were lied to back then as well when they were telling us that this agreement was a path to peace. Well, maybe the Ukrainian negotiators were sincere because they initialed the agreement, but as the chief negotiator recently admitted in a TV interview, Boris Johnson arrived and he forbade them from signing the treaty, so this treaty was not signed. So every time we're trying to show goodwill and put an end to this crisis which started more than a decade ago, and each time we manage to arrive at a certain understanding on both sides, each time this understanding is undermined, not by us, but by the Ukrainians and their masters. On multiple occasions, President Putin said that, and just recently he has reiterated that. He said we are willing to discuss the situation and the security in the region, but of course we need to start by addressing the root causes, and we should take into account the need to secure Russia's security interests, not to the detriment of someone else's security interests, but in the context of general agreements. The OSCE has failed because all the principles underlying the OSCE, such as the equal and indivisible security, not reinforcing one's security at the expense of other security, all of that has been trampled upon. You know, the OSCE has been an embodiment of a Euro-Atlantic concept of security, just as Europe is, because it's about Europe. It comprises Europe and the countries on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, namely the US and Canada. And it turns out that both within NATO and within the OSCE, the only goal Washington pursues is to subject to its will all the countries that are part of these organizations and associations, and also to subject to their will the executive structures of the OSCE, NATO, and right now the EU has recognized NATO as a senior partner, saying that it is willing to provide its territory and also to agree on a shared defense policy. So once again, we are willing to engage in talks, but given the deplorable experience of our previous talks with the Ukrainians and with the West, an agreement which I hope is going to be achieved at a certain point in time, an agreement on European security, and if it provides a basis for settling the Ukrainian crisis, then we're going to be very careful when we analyze that document, and we'll do everything in our power to include clauses which will prevent illegitimate or malicious interpretations from being implemented. Thank you.
Hi, Minister Xu Dezhi with China Central Television. On May 28th, U.S. President Biden, when accepting interview, he said, and I quote, "China got an economy that's on the brink there." According to your observation, how's the performance of Chinese economy? And can you tell us why an economy that's on the brink there would be a what NATO called decisive enabler of the Ukrainian conflict?
What was the last phrase?
He said it's an economy on the brink. So how can an economy on the brink become a decisive enabler? That's what the NATO's communique said on China to become enabler of the Russian-Ukraine conflict.
Я думаю, всем
I think it is clear to everybody how this statement coincides with reality. The Chinese economy is developing at a potent rate. It is developing very well. And yes, indeed, there are attempts to halt these developments. And just recently, when Chairman Xi Jinping was in France, and in addition to Macron, he also met with Ursula von der Leyen. They, the representatives of the European Union, publicly, following these negotiations, stated that we demanded that China reduce production of cutting-edge technological goods because the West has lost its competitive edge. And this is as for how this correlates to the principles of the free market economy and the principles of fair competition. The West is looking to halt the Chinese economy and to have it stop producing high-quality, cheap goods. There are sanctions that are being imposed to halt the development of the Chinese economy. Other economic sanctions are being subjected to sanctions as well. But there should be no doubt whatsoever as to the following. The more restrictions are imposed, which completely discredit what the West has advanced itself. I refer to its globalization, its global superiority. And under these circumstances, the more restrictions are imposed of this kind, the more aggressively the hosts of that same Bretton Woods system act, the more proactively, the more effectively, and the more efficiently the technologies will be produced and products will be produced by those countries against whom these sanctions are being imposed. Of course, this includes the People's Republic of China, it includes the Russian Federation, and this also includes many other states. However, with respect to China, what else is interesting is the following. I read a statement. I believe this was a statement from Jens Stoltenberg, and he commented on military exercises that were held between China and Belarus on Belarusian territory. And he seriously, very with a great emotional charge, said that this is very dangerous affair because the Chinese are moving towards NATO. But as for the Americans moving close to China, that they have surrounded China and Russia, all of this is taking place along our borders with block-based structures. This includes AUKUS, the U.S., Japan, and Korea. The U.S. with South Korea are reaching an agreement on joint nuclear policy, and a great deal else. They're attempting to divide ASEAN. They're attempting to bring other countries into their own ranks, the ranks of those very same parochial, closed bloc structures. And NATO itself took a decision to advance the infrastructure of this bloc, as they say, to the Indo-Pacific region, and practical steps to that end are already being undertaken. And Stoltenberg, immediately in response to questions, said you always called yourselves a defensive alliance, an alliance to defend the territory of member states. He said, yes, remains a defensive alliance, but the threats to our alliance are now global. For this reason, we need to move toward the Indo-Pacific region. I think that the aggressive, unjust essence of this policy is, of course, clear to all. With the People's Republic of China and other partners of ours at the SCO, in our contacts with ASEAN, with the Persian Gulf Cooperation Council, we have always advocated the development of a security model that will be a Eurasian model for security, a model that will be rooted in equality, indivisibility of security, as well as full reciprocal mutual taking into account of interest on the basis of the balance of these interests. I think this is the model for the future. Of course, a great deal of time will be necessary to make this a reality. The President announced this a month ago when he spoke together with the foreign minister, stressing in particular that this initiative stipulates that the Eurasian security system will be open to all countries and organizations in the Eurasian continent, including those who are located in the western part of Eurasia, if and when these countries grasp the fact that NATO-centric alliances or blocs are bringing them are leading them to the wrong direction. There's economic suffering, as you are aware, because it has borne the brunt of the sanctions. It has been forced to stop procuring Ukrainian gas, and this is not. And these are negotiations which are underway. Of course, the Nord Stream pipelines were blown up, and they should have continued to provide for the well-being of the German economy, and with Germany, all of Europe. And when it comes to energy sources, after the imposition of sanctions, Europe began to pay more, 200 billion euros more. There are various laws that were adopted in the United States to counter inflation. And the conclusion, the outcome of this was the fact that European business began to move to the United States. Deindustrialization is what is threatening Europe. So is this the brink or not the brink? Where is the brink? It's not completely accurate when in assessing the Chinese economy on the basis of to assess the Chinese economy on the basis of geopolitical interests. We need to be guided by the facts here.
Sergey
Viktorovich, could you kindly tell us the extent to which the U.S.'s policy of double standards in the Middle East, the extent to which this could result to a full-blown war? On the one hand, the failure to implement Security Council resolutions on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, including on Gaza. On the other hand, there's a demonization of Hamas as well as Hezbollah in Lebanon. Is there not a danger that Iran will enter into a full-blown, direct, open war against Israel? Thank you. The statements that were made by the previous leadership of Iran and the statements made by the newly elected president, these are statements which reflect a very responsible position. Iran is not interested in escalation. And if we are to read analyses, including from the United States and Europe, analysts state that escalation, as the practical developments show, is something which Israel is interested in. And Hezbollah has been very much restrained in its actions. The leader Nasrallah of Hezbollah delivered a number of public statements which reaffirm that position. However, the sentiment is that there's an attempt to provoke them and to provoke them into a full-blown engagement of Hezbollah. And the purpose, the aim of this provocation, as in the view of analysts, is the U.S. Direct participation with its armed forces in this conflict. I very much hope that the West will do everything possible to ensure that these provocative thoughts, these provocative mindsets, if Israel has this, for them to remain mindsets, or better yet, for them to be completely forgotten. We are doing everything possible to calm tensions. But speaking of Iranian interests, naturally, Yemen needs to be mentioned here. And when in response to Israel's operation in Gaza, the collective punishment, yes, the terrorist attack was unacceptable. We always reaffirm this. But when it comes to collective punishment in violation of international humanitarian law, one cannot fight against one form of violation through other violations. It's the same principle here. So Ansar Allah and the Houthis then said that they would stand by the side of the Palestinian people. They would facilitate surmounting of the blockade, help to reach an end to the war inter alia through the use of their capabilities in order to prevent the entry of vessels, navigation of vessels in the Red Sea, which are carrying something for the benefit of Israel. The U.S. response and the U.K.'s response was immediate. They sent an immediate fleet, and instead of seeking a resolution to de-escalate tensions first and foremost, to engage in negotiations with Israel in order to somehow reach an agreement as to how how to implement those resolutions that were adopted after the 4 or 5 vetoes. Ultimately, they remain dead letter. Instead, they resorted to military force. They are shelling Yemeni territory, including objects that have nothing to do with Ansar Allah. There are abundant factors in the region, and some politicians are looking to capitalize on these to foment a large-scale war there inter alia, to gain an opportunity to accuse Iran, not just to accuse Iran, but also to use new cutting-edge weaponry against Iran. This is a short-sighted, futile policy, and we actively stand against it. And we take measures against it, and Arab countries, the Muslim world, the League of Arab States, the Islamic Organization for Islamic Cooperation, all of our allies, and we agree that we cannot allow for this to take place, and we hope that we will achieve that.
Thank you, Maria. Mr. Minister, how do you foresee Russia-U.S. relations if former President Trump is elected, particularly with his vice presidential pick, J.D. Vance, who has commented extensively about Ukraine? I asked you this question in January, but things have changed, and now he is the nominee of the GOP. Thank you.
Ну, может быть,
Well, perhaps something has changed, but it's not our position. You are well aware that we do not interfere in other states' domestic affairs. This includes the United States. We worked with President Trump. We had contacts. He met with President Putin. He hosted me a few times in the White House. Irrespective of his mindset at the time, during the Trump period, the sanctions war began. Obama began this war. Let's state that for to be fair. But under Trump, there were more and more sanctions that were imposed. Economic sanctions, diplomatic sanctions were imposed. However, at that time, as I mentioned already, dialogue was underway between us and Washington at the highest levels. Right now, there is no such dialogue. There was a meeting in June 2021 between Presidents Putin and Biden in Geneva, but after the start of our special military operation, after we explained exhaustively the fact that we have no choice but to defend our security interests, but to defend those people who the Kiev regime labeled terrorists and who have been bombing. They've been bombing every day. After that, there were no longer any contacts, especially at that level. There are sporadic talks taking place, telephone conversations at times. The head of the CIA, Bill Burns, met with the director of the Domestic Intelligence Service last year on neutral territory. There are some telephone conversations at various levels. However, when it comes to substance, we have not seen anything substantive happening here. And when our U.S. colleagues, for example, Jake Sullivan recently announced that we absolutely have to renew dialogue with Russia on strategic stability, we are proposing, and Russia is rejecting it all. Well, this is completely shifting blame, and that is evident that this dialogue on strategic stability requires the presence of relations, first and foremost, mutually respectful relations on equal footing, and all of this was set out in the documents we reached with the U.S., including the strategic offensive arms. But when you label publicly, Austin, I believe, labeled Russia the enemy, the main threat, we need to do everything possible for Ukraine to win, he said. Biden was recently quoted, the U.S. president recently said that if Russia wins in Ukraine, then, I believe this is a direct quote, Poland will disappear and other countries up to the Balkans will perceive themselves to be more independent, and they will comport themselves in a more independent way. So if we give some thought to this, it's a deep thought. In Ukraine, the Russians need to be vanquished for the U.S. to then preserve completely under its command all of Europe. And that's the essence here. So I'll reiterate that, and Putin mentioned this repeatedly, we will work with any American leader. We will remain ready to work with any U.S. leader who the U.S. people elect and which the leader will be willing to engage in equitable, mutually respectful dialogue. I wish to recall once again what I stated during the Trump administration. Despite the very serious sanctions, there was still dialogue underway. And this is useful in any case. If you read yesterday, perhaps you heard the Foreign Minister of Hungary, Peter Sziráty, spoke, and a great deal of his statement was dedicated to the way virtually all the rest of the European Union is beginning to engage in acts of sabotage and boycotting the events of the Hungarian chairmanship because Viktor Orban traveled to Russia and China and because he is advocating for peace. That is shocking. The European Union, which was established in order to ensure the well-being, prosperity, and stability of all of its members, has now completely morphed into an appendage of NATO. And just as aggressively, and perhaps even more aggressively, there are demands for Russia to be vanquished. What kind of strategic dialogue is this? Or any other kind of dialogue can we even talk about here? And if our colleagues give this a second thought, if they surmount this mania of their own exceptionalism, their own impunity, their own superiority, then we'll sit down with them. We'll listen to what they have to tell us. But if when it comes to running around and trying to persuade them, that's not how we operate. It's not part of our tradition.
Thank you, Maria. Abdul Hamid Sayam from the Arabic Daily Al-Quds Al-Arabi. Thank you, Mr. Minister, for coming again to talk to us. I've been asking you about the two-state solution, not this time. Don't you see that the war on Gaza also shows that the major failure of international community, failure of international law, failure of ICJ to impose its provisional measures, 4 resolution in the Security Council, 2 in the GA, and yet the genocide war is continuing. And how do you see the common areas between the war in Gaza, supported by NATO members, especially the US, and the war in Ukraine, supported by NATO as well? Thank you.
First and foremost, you're absolutely right. It's not the situation in Gaza, which is a failure of the the international community. It is indeed a failure of the international community, but the failure is the failure to implement U.S. and Security Council resolutions on the establishment of a Palestinian state, which should have emerged concurrently with the state of Israel within the borders. Completely different than those little clumps of territory which the Palestinians currently possess. I spoke about this in detail today, and the majority of other delegations also spoke about this at length and in detail. And the head of the cabinet of Antonio Guterres, Mr. Rotrey, reading the statement from the Secretary General, very explicitly stated the truth. And the truth is as follows. Of course, we all say that there's a need to implement resolutions listing the names on the establishment of a Palestinian state within the 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as a capital, to bring back ensure the return of refugees, and for this state to coexist in peace and security with Israel. And then Mr. Rattray mentioned the example, referred to how the situation on the ground looks. The territories that the Palestinians held in 1967 and what is currently actually under the control of the Palestinian National Administration on the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Gaza is a specific case here. Once again, a specific statute to Israel is once again stating that there is a need to preserve control of Gaza along the perimeter. This will be a continuation of the blockade. And there were a multitude of resolutions. You're absolutely right. Virtually not a single of those resolutions has been implemented. I remember when the Quartet of International Mediators in the mid-1990s adopted a roadmap and the way everybody applauded then. And this roadmap explicitly spelled out every step by the week, by the month, and it set out that in a year a Palestinian state would be established with compromises as compared to the initial resolutions. And that is unfortunate.
Поддержка
Regarding the comparison between support to Israel and support to Ukraine, they do have a lot in common. Let me give you the figures. In 10 months, almost 10 months, since Israel has been conducting its operation in the Gaza Strip, roughly 40,000 civilians have died, mostly women and children, and roughly 80,000 people have been injured. That's just in a matter of 10 months. Civilian losses on both sides, on the Donbass side and on the Ukrainian side, in a decade since the coup d'etat, are half that figure. So the scale is frightful. And since you've brought up this issue, there's a component of this whole situation. That's the UN and the Secretariat, the UN Secretariat. Recently, when we struck military and also energy infrastructure in Ukraine that's related to the military, one of these missiles were shot down by Ukrainian air defenses. And these air defenses were in fact deployed there in violation of international humanitarian law next to residential housing, social facilities, and some of what was struck down fell on Ahmeded, a children's hospital in Kiev. 2 people died, and roughly 20 were injured, sustained injuries of various sorts. Mr. Dujarric, or is it Dujarric, what's the right pronunciation? Then the very next day, he accused the Russian Federation on behalf of the Secretary General. He called for an end to be put to this. And yet, at the very start of the operation in Gaza, following the 7th October terrorist attacks, there were strikes on the Al-Ahli hospital. I think that was in late October, early November 2023. And according to various statistics, 80 people perished and several hundred were injured. The Secretary General commented on this, and the comment wasn't very clear. It wasn't clear who actually was behind the strike. He condemned the strike. He called for an avoidance of such violations of international humanitarian law, IHL, but by then everyone knew full well who was behind the attacks. And then when the next day Mr. Dujarric was asked, did you get to the bottom of who was behind this? He said, I can't add anything to what I already said yesterday. So the double standards are absolutely obvious. You partake in these briefings. You've probably seen many more examples of this. It's regrettable. Article 100 of the UN Charter speaks to neutrality and the impartiality which UN staff must abide by. So it's clear that the West has basically privatized the UN Secretariat, UN bodies.
Susan Tehrani from India's WION International Network. My question is somewhat a follow-up to Pam's about Senator J.D. Vance's recent comments, not only about him criticizing aid to Ukraine, but he also called for negotiated peace in Ukraine, and he's been a critic of the Biden administration's overall policy when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. I'd like to get your views on his recent comments about aid to Ukraine, and also what would final borders look like in a negotiated settlement agreed by Moscow should, for example, Senator Vance's suggestions move forward? Thank you.
Well, I heard the same thing you did. He's in favor of peace, in favor of ending the assistance that's been provided, and we can only welcome that because that's what we need to stop pumping Ukraine full of weapons, and then the war will end. And then we can look for solutions. But of course, we're talking about solutions which take into account the reality of the situation on the ground. Not just on the ground, but also the reality of political life. This includes the fact that after, Boris Johnson, in April of 2022, with the support of the US, he basically torpedoed the peace agreements. Had he not done that, had he not scuppered that deal, a significant portion of those territories which subsequently held referendums and became a part of Russia, those territories would have remained Ukrainian, and yet they held referenda. And they did that for that very reason, because they understood that the West was going to scupper any deals, and that Kiev is not a regime that you can do business with. The DPR, the LPR, Kherson and Zaporizhia, as you know, held referenda. They're now part and parcel of the Russian Federation. That's enshrined in our constitution, and there's no use discussing that any further. It's non-negotiable. We can't leave those people to their own devices. We haven't liberated all of that territory, but we can't just leave these people behind, people who voted in favor of coming back into Russia's fold. We can't leave them under the yoke of a regime which is destroying all that is Russian. I mentioned that in my speech, in fact, a very important fact. All of these various initiatives that are being floated, it's absolutely right that our Chinese colleagues drew attention to the fact that we need to deal with the root causes, to address those causes, rightly so. But everyone else, the West, the Zelensky plan, the peace formula, what the West is promoting, in none of those plans do they talk about human rights and the rights of national minorities. But the West adores talking about these topics, as you know. And that begs the question, we ask them, why? Why are they being omitted? We recently had contacts, these were off the books, contacts amongst political scientists who know each other already, who understand the policies of their governments. So our political scientists asked the American political scientists, how do you see this playing out when eventually some kind of settlement is going to be crafted? Some part of Ukraine, Western Ukraine, for instance, will be controlled by those who are going to be signing the peace agreements. Do you, Americans, support the inclusion into these agreements an abolition of those laws which banned the use of Russian language across all areas of life? And they said, no, we won't meddle in the internal affairs of Ukrainians. It's up to them whether to revoke those laws. And just going back to Bergenstock, the Zelensky formula is a 10-point plan. It's a 10-point plan. There were 10 points from the outset. And one of those points is that Russia must revert to 1991 borders. A tribunal needs to be established to bring to trial the Russian leadership, reparations. What's to happen with those weapons, Russian weapons? Also, power, humanitarian, nuclear issues, exchange of prisoners of war, the list goes on. This plan is extremely arrogant, and it's a dead end, in fact. That's obvious. They're trying to invite as many people possible to these events, specifically Bergenstock, as a matter of priority. They're trying to coax these participants to focus on those parts of the plan about which there cannot be any doubts, such as food supplies, power, and so on. But in Bergenstock, there were 3 topics on the agenda, and this is quite telling, in fact. It's food security, the first topic, although the West is itself undermining food security by forcing the European Union. In fact, the European Union is forcing its own producers to suffer to the benefit of Ukrainian farmers. As you know, they produce grain that is not of high quality, nor is it cheap, but that's a separate issue. And in fact, the Secretary General, and we very much value his efforts directed at implementing the UN Russia Memorandum, which sets forth the steps for removing restrictions on Russian fertilizer and foodstuff exports. So I mentioned humanitarian issues as well. That's the second point of that plan. And then the third point is nuclear security. Now, they initially spoke to security of energy supplies, and then I wondered why they had nuclear in there. They took out energy security. Had they kept that in there, we would have had to discuss who it was that blew up the Nord Stream pipelines, but they wanted to divert attention from that topic as soon as possible. Although we will insist on getting to the bottom of things regarding what happened with the Nord Stream pipelines. Speaking at the Security Council, we will remind everyone that that topic is still relevant, because when Sweden, which said that it was conducting an investigation, Sweden said that we held an investigation, it took 2 years, we didn't find anything, case closed. We don't think this is below any politicians. Germany is staying silent on the issue. So we're going to demand that, and we're going to demand that whenever accusations are leveled at us, I'll probably write another letter to the Secretary General. Bucha, in April of 2022. Bucha was used to scupper, to sink the peace deal. I told you on numerous occasions, I spoke to this at the Security Council as well. If you harbored so much ire because there was supposedly this aggressive attack on civilians waged by the Russian army, why are you no longer talking about this? In order to somehow explain away what happened in Bucha, we asked for the names of people whose bodies were shown in BBC reports. But no one even intends to give us those lists. Nor does Germany intend to share the tests they ran on the late Alexei Navalny. Tests on the basis of which they said that we poisoned him. We asked them for those test results and they said, sorry, we can't. They say, if we share those, give us the intelligence you have on biological weapons. If you don't want to share that, fine. So that raises a lot of questions. I have a whole list of questions, in fact, and we're going to insist on getting the truth from the West, because unless we do that, we can't have trust. And in fact, on energy, those pipelines, those Nord Stream pipelines, pipeline gas, liquefied natural gas, what they're trying to ban, all of that is directly linked to the food security crisis. The food crisis in the EU, production of fertilizers has fallen sharply as a result of the very high gas prices we're seeing. So this is all inextricably linked. And I think it's below any country to accuse the Russian Federation of fomenting this, especially below those states which are members of the Security Council. They should recognize their responsibility for what's going on.
This is Arun Lewis from Indo-Asian News Service. Could you give your observation on Indian Prime Minister Modi's visit to Moscow recently, and also your reactions to the opposition that India faces for the energy cooperation with Russia?
I think India is a great power.
which sets its own national interests, determines its own national interests, chooses its own partners. And we know that India is being subject to enormous pressure, completely unjustified pressure in the international arena. So just recently, Zelensky, or I think someone from Zelensky's team it was, talked about Narendra Modi's trip to Russia, and he called that trip a stabbing in the back of all peace efforts. So that was very insulting, and the Ukrainian ambassador was called in, and the Indian Ministry of Foreign Affairs talked to him about how he should be behaving. So the ambassadors were really behaving as if they were hooligans. There was an ambassador to Germany, and he was outraged, consistently outraged that Olaf Scholz is not giving him enough money, enough weapons. And in an interview, he publicly called the Chancellor of Germany liver sausage. This is a quote, you can find it online. The ambassador of Ukraine to Kazakhstan publicly said in an interview, "We'll do everything we can to kill as many Russians as possible so that our children have less work to do. We'll see this job through to the end." So I think India is doing everything right, and my colleagues, Brahmani and Jishankar, after a tour of Western states, answering questions, including the question, why are you buying more oil from Russia? He cited statistics, and those statistics showed that the West has also increased its purchases of gas from the Russian Federation, despite some of the restrictions that have been imposed, gas and oil as well. And then he went on to say that India will decide for itself how to trade with whom and how to defend its national interests. But the fact that the West is exhibiting its displeasure to powers like China, like India, well, it shows their lack of erudition, their inability to partake in diplomacy, and also it speaks to the failure of political analysts. Because speaking this way to these great Asian powers, I mean, you might dream of that, but it's really beneath them. It's really beneath them behaving in this way vis-a-vis any and all countries, but in particular when they're speaking in this way to these two giants, these two great powers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. It's always nice to see you in this room. All of the journalists greatly appreciate it. You say that there must be a new world order that is multipolar. You say it is already happening. What role do you see for the United States in the new world order?
Ну, надо просто смириться с реальностью.
Well, they simply have to accept the reality, and they should stop laying a claim to managing everything everywhere. Well, curiously, there was a conversation. There is Michael Baum, a journalist working in Russia. He is a free journalist, a freelance journalist, Michael Baum. He is invited to different talk shows. He speaks Russian very well. I think recently he gave an interview and he got pretty much the same question. What should the US do? How to live in a multipolar world where everyone is equal? His response was, well, just briefly to summarize, he said, there were periods when the US self-isolated, and those were the periods when the most serious conflicts were raging on, and when the US got back as a leader to the world arena, the number of wars got down. I have a great deal of respect for journalists, and of course every journalist has a right to share their point of view, but the thing is, this is simply not true. When the US entered the world arena in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, how did that end? Has there been any peaceful changes for the better? Incidentally, right now there is a constant mantra saying that we're gonna support Ukraine as long as it takes. How long will it gonna take? Is it gonna take as long as Afghanistan, 20 years to come to realize that you've lost? Or in Iraq, which you left, even though you're trying to stay there despite the decision by the Iraqi parliament that the US should withdraw its troops? Or Libya, is it going to be the same approach applied to Ukraine? How long did it take for them to dismantle everything in Libya? And right now they're trying to repair that, putting the pieces back together. So a multipolar world is a reality. It's not just a made-up fiction. If you look at the share, the world GDP share, the US and the West account for, and they used to account for 50 years ago, 20 years ago, and right now you'll see that, the 5 founding members of the BRICS Association, I think a couple of years ago, in terms of its GDP in purchasing parity, overtook the G7. Right now, we've got another 5 countries that have joined BRICS, so this ratio is going to change in BRICS' favor. The US is doing everything in its power to make sure that the weight of new centers of power shouldn't be reflected in the IMF or in the World Bank. The US still holds on to a very big package of votes, around 15%, but under the IMF rules, it allows them to block any decisions. Even though if we're to get it squarely, all of that quotas, all of those votes should have been redistributed, and this is something we are insisting upon, and this is the issue we're going to bring up during the Kazan summit of BRICS in October this year. The same goes for the WTO. In the past, it was promoted by everyone as the best regulator, the just regulator of the world trade. Once China started to overtake the US in terms of its competitive edge, thanks to the development of its economy based on the principles of globalization, even though these principles is something the US had come up with some time ago. And so China started to get ahead of the US, and the US simply shut down the WTO talks on the dispute resolution mechanism. There were some technicalities they used. There is no quorum, and for many years, all the complaints that China has been lodging for the US protectionism have been shelved. And this is a subject we're going to bring up during the BRICS summit. We are going to seek a solution to that. These are the topics that are going to be prioritized also during the G20 summit in Rio de Janeiro, because this is the mechanism that should address economic issues and should take steps with a view to developing the world economy based on mutual benefit and giving each country's share and contribution to the world economy. Well, you see, if we have a look at Eurasia, you'll see that there is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian Economic Union, ASEAN, and all of these associations have agreements with China on harmonizing these integration projects with China's project of One Belt, One Road. There are also countries of the Gulf, basically they fall within Eurasia as well. And when all of these countries are fostering ties between one another, they are basically weaving the fabric for future Eurasian integration cooperation based on relative advantages provided by God for the development of this space, which is so richly endowed with natural resources, which is so important from the point of view of world logistics, and we advocate these processes very energetically. At the same time, when the US, when its allies slapped unprecedented sanctions on Russia, on Iran, Venezuela, and they're also introducing sanctions against China, as I mentioned previously, and against other countries as well. Countries in Africa and Latin America started to give more thought to securing themselves against such whims of the US, because no one knows whom the US is going to take issue with in future. So during the last G20 summit, there was an idea promoted, I think it was last year during the BRICS summit. There was an idea promoted by President Putin on setting up alternative settlement and financial transactions mechanisms, and the BRICS countries, the central banks, are looking into that actively. The recommendations are going to be drafted for the summit. And within the framework of CELAC, President Lula has also floated the idea of moving towards a single currency. Everyone is trying to protect themselves. Just recently, Saudi Arabia said, well, you know, there's been a leak that they think that right now, when the US and the collective West are trying to take away Russia's money, to steal Russia's money, they are thinking on de-dollarizing their economy, on decreasing their dependence on the dollar. And de-dollarization is happening. You know, you mentioned President Trump, and he said that it was suicidal. But it's the US that's at the origin of this de-dollarization process. So there is a group of regional associations, CELAC, African associations, Asian associations. They are working together with one another. And certainly at the global level, BRICS has every chance to turn into a harmonizer for similar processes across different regions where the countries of the world majority are represented. And of course, there's the G20 that I've mentioned. And within the G20, the world majority is going to continue talking to the West, provided that the West is willing to have a frank conversation. There's also the UN, where every country is represented and everyone needs to talk to one another. Yesterday, the Foreign Minister of Hungary, Mr. Szijjártó, spoke on the subject, and he said, I've always been convinced that the UN has been established for everyone to talk to everyone, but so far, this is not the case. The West has decided that the UN has been established to bolster its arrogant claims to world hegemony. I think at a certain point in time, the US comes to realize that it's better to be part of a constructive process rather than going around other countries using the sanctions truncheon, trying to make everyone to dance to their tune. And you know, the tune constantly is changing every 4 years. Everyone is trying to get accustomed to that, to adapt, but it's difficult given the internal political specifics of the US.
Please, Известия.
Николай Иванов,
Nikolai Ivanov, Izvestia news agency. You met the foreign minister of Lebanon. Has there been any talk about a ceasefire on the borders of Lebanon, or are both countries ready for a full-blown war? I've commented on that. Neither Hezbollah nor the government of Lebanon nor Iran want a full-blown war. And there's a suspicion that some circles in Israel are trying to achieve just that, to provoke a full-blown war, trying to engage the US, trying to make them mired in that war as well. And I think it's terrible if some groups are trying to prioritize their personal interests rather than the interests of their own nation.
Me? Thank you, Masha. welcome. It's been a long time since we've known each other. I found today's, your explanations, particularly on economic links, very rewarding and things I hadn't thought of. Other times I find it has a feeling of gaslighting when Russia has aimed fire at a children's hospital in Ukraine and there is enough material on Bucha around, as there is on Navalny. But what I really wanted to ask you is that the appreciation of Russian culture, art, music, and so forth is done by journalists who have ties to Russia and have grown up speaking the language, whether it's Evan Gershkovich or Masha, there are Russian-born journalists or journalists of the Russian culture, and I'm surprised that Russia doesn't try to appeal to them rather than punishing them. Not every story will be a good story, but they are capable of bringing the culture of Russia to the world.
Evelyn, во-первых...
Evelyn, to start with, you said something as the first part of your question. You said there's a lot of evidence of what happened at that children's hospital in Bucha or what happened to Navalny. This is not what I was speaking about. There can be many testimonies provided there are journalists who know what their task is. There's something concrete that I said. I said we wanted to have a list of people whose bodies were shown in the BBC broadcasts from Bucha. No, we're not getting those lists. No one is providing those lists to us. Now, as for Navalny, every human life is invaluable. I meant no double entendre or whatever. We were accused of poisoning Navalny. The analysis had been carried out in a German military hospital, in a Russian civilian hospital, before he was handed over to his spouse and he was transported to Germany. Even though that happened swiftly, nothing was revealed in his analysis from there. And in the civilian hospital in Germany, nothing was found. So the test evidence they were speaking about was found in the military hospital, and wanted to get those analyses. And if you think that it's only fair to accuse us saying that there is evidence we're not going to provide to you, well, maybe then you should join the US politics. Speaking about journalists, I did not quite grasp whom you were referring to, why we're not releasing some journalists or whatever. What is it you were talking about?
Masha Gessen. There must be more journalists with Russian ties who are being punished by Russia one way or another.
We have a Masha of our own. We have our own Masha. And just recently she made a post citing Somerset Maugham and many other journalists and writers, showing that the use of journalists for intelligence gathering purposes, at least in the Anglo-Saxon world, is a tradition. And we've got irrefutable evidence corroborating that Gershkovich was involved in some espionage activities. The intelligence services of two countries, based on the agreement of President Putin and President Biden from June 2021, have been involved in contacts looking into the possibility of an exchange. Everyone knows that this topic needs to be discussed calmly, confidentially, even though it's constantly being introduced into the public space by American journalists, which is not helping. But the contacts are ongoing. It has nothing to do with any attacks on journalism. And I would like to assure you that just as much as you do, we are in favor of journalism and freedom of speech. And you remember when our journalists started to be chased away, when our media outlets were shut down, first we preferred not to respond. We spoke about that with Maria, and I said we shouldn't act as they do. We should stick to our principles. Incidentally, these are the principles underlying the OSCE, but it went too far. It went to some hideous, terrible steps, absolutely reckless steps, and we've been obliged to respond an eye for an eye.
Much experience, well-known and famous journalists. Could you assist us in getting this list of so-called killed people in Bucha? We failed in this, and we even asked Secretary General, and he didn't
Я сказал об этом, но Мария...
I said that, but Maria is correct. It would be a good thing if journalists get involved, because they are representing this function of getting to the bottom of truth. They should ask these questions, because seemingly no one is interested in that. Dozens of people were killed there. Thank you. This is the end of the press conference. And colleagues, I would like to wish you every success in the very difficult mission you are performing. I'm hopeful that there's not going to be a ban on your profession. Well, I do hope that there's going to be as little restrictions against your profession as possible. Thank you.